How big a TV to buy is usually the first and often the most difficult dilemma for a new buyer. Online, everyone says something different, or you'll mostly hear things like, "No screen is ever too big." So why make another video on this topic? Well, because in my work calibrating TVs, I visited several thousand households, and barely anyone was fully satisfied with their choice of screen size. Most buyers felt stressed when they had to make the decision of purchasing a much bigger TV than before. And attempting to measure the size on the wall, like with tape or cardboard, didn't help at all. So how do you choose to avoid regret? I'll answer you thoroughly and clear up the most common doubts, but you'll need to dedicate a few minutes to watching the episode until the end, because as usual, the topic can't be summed up in just one sentence. Let's begin with what likely interests the majority of people watching this channel. How big of a TV should we pick if we're movie lovers and want the ultimate viewing experience? Or if we mainly watch sports and want to feel like we're at the stadium? The answer for most buyers is incredibly simple. All you need to do is ask yourself one killer, but insanely important question. When you once sat in a cinema hall, somewhere about 3/4 of the distance from the screen, was it comfortable to watch? Same here. And that's because movies and shows are actually made with the idea of playback in those conditions in mind. Same with sports, where wide-angle shots dominate and which are also very enjoyable to watch in a multiplex cinema. The same goes for gaming on a console. Let's apply some simple math. The screen size and distance can be converted to how many degrees of the field of view the screen fills in a cinema, and then we can create the same proportion for the diagonals of a home TV. As you can see, to achieve that effect, which is usually why you look for tickets in this part of the theater, we should aim for up to 100 inches from just under 3 meters. If we only have 2 meters to the screen, it turns out that even 65 inches is already too small, and if we have a slightly larger living room, there aren't even TVs on the market that could bring us close to that effect. Then you can consider choosing a home projector, which allows for a larger size, and that's essentially the only advantage this device has over a TV, as I showed in this comparison test. And now, why do I claim that this answers most dilemmas? Because online I mostly see questions of this type. As you can see, in none of these cases will the interested person come anywhere close to achieving a pleasant cinematic effect by choosing the largest diagonal they were considering. Future buyers are therefore afraid to purchase a screen where the spectacle will feel as if we're sitting much farther back than the last row of the theater. That's exactly why the statement, "the bigger, the better," is almost always true. Simply put, in the course of my work with screen calibrations, I've visited several thousand households, and I don't recall anyone ever complaining that he went overboard with the screen size. Very often, though, I heard, "Damn, I could have gone bigger." Many people often try this experiment with tape or cardboard before buying. They measure out the size of the new screen and carefully cut or mark the outline of the new TV. However, there is a certain problem with this which even very old studies have shown. Small diagonals don't encourage us to get closer to the screen like large ones do. There's simply a certain minimum distance below which the viewer doesn't feel comfortable. For example, if we have less than 2 meters, it's hard to comfortably settle in front of the screen, especially with several people, and it's difficult to achieve decent sound. Because of that, you can't replicate the effect a large TV has on us by moving closer to the small TV we currently own. And you can't truly experience it by setting up a cardboard mock-up or just hanging tape on the wall. The second option can only show us, at best, how the interior decoration will change, but certainly not how we'll feel in front of the large screen we want to acquire. Here I suggest trusting reliable mathematics, which shows us how to achieve a cinematic effect, so that later you don't say, "Damn, I could have bought a bigger one." However, in my opinion, striving for the largest size shouldn't always be the goal. There are many people who aren't into movie screenings, TV series, or sports events. They don't want a home theater, they just want to have the TV on in the background so it's not quiet at home and catch the evening news. Contrary to appearances, there are many people like that, so I'd say skip worrying about cinematic effects and just go for a solid 55-inch TV instead. Exactly, that specific diagonal has a certain quality. It's the size that usually has the best price per inch ratio. Also, going down to a smaller size like 42, 48, or 50 inches, we either have a much smaller selection of models and technologies or an absurdly small price saving. Very often, these smaller TVs are also compromised, for example, by lower brightness or a 60 Hz refresh rate. An additional advantage of 55 inches is that it's a completely uncontroversial size. You can comfortably place it in an 8-meter room without it feeling overwhelming when turned off. On the other hand, even in a 100-meter living room, you can easily spot the news headlines on it. When we need a TV for such casual watching, it's worth checking out solutions like the Samsung D-Frame or TCL NX T-Frame, which do a pretty decent job of mimicking artwork in standby mode and don't disrupt the aesthetics of the living room. And what about those who are on the opposite end of the spectrum and remained unimpressed by these cinema-like features? Was choosing an even bigger screen for a given distance going too far? So I looked for the answer to that question pretty thoroughly in the episode titled, "Is a 100-inch TV too big for an apartment?" In short, I tried watching movies on it from a distance of less than 2.5 meters. What do you think the effect was? An overwhelming image, like the front row in a cinema? Sore eyes or fatigue? Not at all. It enhanced the feeling of immersion, pulling you even deeper into the story or the match's emotions. It was absolutely fantastic to play. However, it has to be said that the news channels sometimes looked a bit strange. Typical TV footage is indeed different from film and series footage, and under such extreme conditions, the big faces effect can occur. If we are typical movie enthusiasts or gamers, we can confidently choose even such large screens for short distances. But at this point, it's a bit of an artificial digression because if someone has the budget to buy a high-end TV with a diagonal over 100 inches, they probably aren't watching it from a distance like in a studio apartment. But moving forward, as screens get cheaper, the dilemma will stay the same over time. I think the 2 centimeters per inch barrier is the absolute limit. It's the point where we start to see individual pixels on a 4K display, so the image quality will visually degrade even on the best sources. Of course, 8K displays and native content at that resolution might help with this at some point, but either way, such a large screen-to-distance ratio will significantly deviate from recording standards, and in my opinion, not everything will look good. Let's come back down to earth and have a chat about a far more practical dilemma. So is it better to go for a larger screen size but a weaker TV model, or a better one but with a smaller size? That question depends on so many factors that the answer has to be tailored to the specific user's situation. You can receive such personalized guidance by consulting a specialist at www.choose.tv, which I highly recommend for making the most informed and wise investment decisions. If I had to respond in the most general way, I would phrase it like this. If we are working with a very tight budget and must choose between the best size or the best quality, then the smart move is to go for reasonable quality and prioritize the largest size we can get. There's no point in having 85 inches if it has low brightness and poor blacks, as you can see now on the screen, when for the same amount you could get a good 75-inch TV. In my opinion, there are 2 quality thresholds. The first one is moving from a regular LCD TV to a mini LED with local dimming, and the second is upgrading to an OLED. Within the same category, it doesn't make much sense to pay extra for a higher-end model compared to a larger one, especially if we're not sitting significantly far from the screen, like 4 meters or more. It probably sounded a bit complicated, so let's break it down with specific examples. Suppose we have $945 to spend. At that price, we can get a 75-inch TCL or Xiaomi, which will be regular LCD TVs without local dimming. We could also get a 65-inch Q80D with local dimming, or a 55-inch QN85D, which is a more advanced version of the Q80D with mini-LED technology. In this case, I would definitely choose option number 2. Let's take a look at the black level comparison on each of these TVs. As you can see on regular LCDs, dark scenes look pretty poor compared to TVs with local dimming. The QN85D's benefit isn't quite substantial enough to justify sacrificing 10 inches. Now the second example. We have $2,700 for OLEDs. It gets us the 55-inch Sony A95L, the 65-inch Samsung S95D, or the 77-inch LG B4. Without hesitation, I would choose the B4 here. Sure, the difference between a basic OLED and a high-end QD OLED is noticeable, as you can see on our website. But even the basic model made with this technology offers such high image quality that the extra inches of the screen definitely add more value. With this choice, I would only break this rule if I was selecting a TV for a really small room. If my couch was less than 2.5 meters from the screen, then maybe I would go for the intermediate option, the 65-inch S95D. Such alternatives could be discussed, of course, for days on end. However, I hope you got the general idea of what I was going for. The hardest part is when we hesitate, for example, between a 55-inch OLED and a 65-inch LCD TV. Unfortunately, there's no clear answer to this. At the end of the episode, let's explore the most common myths about buying a large TV, which are often brought up in these debates. Point 1. You'll ruin your eyesight. The size of the screen in no way contributes to ruining your eyesight, as long as we follow proper viewing habits. First of all, we should use proper background lighting. Secondly, for night viewing, we should set the appropriate screen brightness so that the display doesn't glare. Helpful will also be the image calibration process, which restores the natural tone with far less blue light compared to the default settings. Point 2. I'll shake my head like in the front row at the cinema. That didn't happen even when I sat 2 meters from 100 inches in the earlier experiment. The front row in the cinema typically has a ratio of 1 centimeter for every single inch of the screen. In other words, it's like sitting 3 meters away from a screen made up of 9 separate 100-inch displays. That would never happen in a home setup. Point 3, you'll see giant heads on the TV. When it comes to movies, series, sports, and games, like I said before, there's no such risk. Movie productions are made with the intention of being shown on very large screens. That's why the framing and editing are done in such a way that a person can comfortably take in the key elements of the scene. In that case, a large TV can really deliver a cinematic effect, which is, after all, what we're aiming for. And so we've reached the end of today's episode. Let us know in the comments what size your screen is and from what distance you usually watch it. See you next time.